My neighbor's dog horror story. This is a long story, so get comfy. I moved to a new house when I was 8. Life wasn't really going that good for me and my family at where we were before, so we had to move. We got to the new house and I was playing in the backyard while my parents unpacked the boxes and stuff, and there was a swing set back there, so I was playing there. I was climbing up the ladder so I could go down the slide when I heard a dog barking from the distance. I couldn't exactly at first point where it was coming from, but after listening for a few seconds I realized it was coming from the neighbor's house. I finished climbing up the ladder and went down the slide, then started walking towards the neighbor's house. I walked up to the window of the kitchen and saw a woman who looked to be in her early 30s wearing an apron facing away from me. She was putting something into the stove. It smelled really good. It looked like pie. I love pie. She turned around and saw me in the window and smiled. She walked over and opened the window and said to me, "Well, hello there. I take it you're the new neighbor's kid. What's your name, sweetie?" She was smiling the whole time, and she looked and seemed to be a very nice woman, so I told her, "Abigail." "Abigail, that's a pretty name. My son's name is Robert. He's turning 9 tomorrow, so I'm making his favorite pie for him. What kind of pie is it?" I asked her. "It's a chocolate-covered apple pie. My mom used to make those for my grandfather before he passed away. It was my favorite kind of pie too." I told her it was my favorite kind of pie too. She laughed and said to me, "Well, I cooked 3 more earlier, and I will be baking until he gets home, which still isn't for another couple hours," she said before looking up and over at my parents unloading the trucks and looked back at me with an even bigger smile and said, "Would you like to come inside and have a piece of pie?" I was 8 and a nice lady just offered me my favorite home-cooked pie, so of course, I said yes. She laughed and said, "Okay then, great." The door I unlocked. "Just come right on in and I'll get you a piece and a glass of milk." I smiled and ran to the door and went inside. She pulled me up a chair to the table that already had a big glass of milk and a plate with a big fresh piece of pie sitting there waiting for me. She handed me a fork and told me to dig in. I must have looked like a starved child because when I took the first bite of the pie, it was so good, and I mean so good, like it wasn't even humanly possible for something to taste this good, so I was slamming that pie down. She smiled and giggled and asked me if I wanted to watch some cartoons. She has cable and can get the Boomerang channel. Now the Boomerang channel is also my favorite channel because it had all of my favorite cartoons on it, so I said yes with even more happiness as she smiled again and grabbed the remote. She turned on the TV and asked what I wanted to watch. I said I wanted to watch Courage the Cowardly Dog, and she smiled and said that that was her son's favorite show too, as she turned the show on. She handed me another piece of pie and told me to enjoy it since my first piece was already gone, and she told me I could have the whole pie if I wanted because no one likes her cooking other than her son. As the spoiled little 8-year-old girl in me started going crazy inside as I started thinking to myself how cool and nice this woman was. I asked her how no one liked her cooking because it was the best thing I had ever eaten. She just smiled and thanked me as she refilled my glass with some more milk. I sat there eating pie and watching cartoons for about 20 minutes until I heard my mom outside calling for me. I told the woman I had to go and that my mom was calling for me. She looked out the window at my mom and then back at me. She smiled again, but this time, it wasn't that happy of a smile. I mean, like it didn't look real, like she was faking it. But then she said, "Okay dear." I got out of the chair and headed to the door when I remembered the dog and asked, "Where's your dog?" She looked at me without changing her facial expression, which was kind of weird, and said, "Oh, you mean Coco? Yes, he's sleeping in my son's room right now." I said okay and I asked what her name was. She said, "You can just call me Mrs. Bell, sweetie." I said okay, well thank you, Mrs. Bell, I loved your pie. She said, "Would you like to take a piece home with you for your parents? Or for you to eat later?" I said yes please, and she gave me a piece in a Ziploc bag. I put it in the book bag I had with me that I kept all my toys in and thanked her again, and before I walked out she asked, "Would you like to come to Robert's birthday party tomorrow? It'll be at 3 o'clock. I said I'll have to ask my mom, but I would love to. She smiled and said okay, that's great. I said goodbye to her before leaving and going to my mom. My mom asked where I went and I told her that I went over to the nice neighbor's Mrs. Bell's house. She asked me who Mrs. Bell was and what I did with her. I told her the whole story and she looked half scared and half relieved, like she didn't know how to feel. I told her I had a piece of her amazing pie that she gave me for them to try, and she told me to give it to her. I didn't know why at the time, but my back was turned to Mrs. Bell's house and I saw my mom look up and over my head at the house. She asked, "There are people living in there?" I said, "Yeah, Mrs. Bell and her 9-year-old son Robert. Tomorrow he turns 9 and she asked me if I wanted to go tomorrow to his party and it'll be at 3 o'clock. My mom said we'll see and told me to get her out the piece of the pie. I opened my bag and started looking for it, but I couldn't find it. It wasn't in my bag. It couldn't have fallen out. I told my mom and she told me it's fine and to go help my dad with my room. I said okay and went inside. That night I was asleep. It was 10 p.m. and I heard the same dog barking from the neighbor's house. I got up and went to the window and looked down at the house. There weren't any lights on in the house, and there still weren't any cars in the driveway. I started thinking, why didn't the dog come out of the room earlier when I was there? And why did the barking stop as soon as I went in? I just realized that. The next day I got up and went outside to play on the swings and I heard the dog barking again, so I went over to the house and looked in the window. I could hear someone inside, like rummaging through things, but all the lights were off. I was about to knock on the window when I heard a loud bark come from right behind me. I jumped and fell when I heard it and turned around to see no dog there. It was a vicious bark, like from a hungry Rottweiler. I got up and ran back to my house and ran to tell my parents. They were very concerned, so they called the landlord and asked about the lady and her kid. The landlord said that there was no one with those names living there and that there was currently no one living there. I saw my mom's face turn pale as he said this. She looked at me with a face of horror and asked me if that was the right house and I confirmed, but that just made her more upset. The landlord told us that he was going to come to our house and that he'll be there in 10 minutes. They hung up and my mom started asking me loads of questions that I gave the typical 8-year-old answers to, and when my mom finally realized that asking me these questions wasn't doing any good, she told me to go play in my room and she'll make me a sandwich for lunch. I said okay and went up to my room. She brought me up the sandwich and told me to just stay in there and play while she talks to the landlord. I said okay and ate my sandwich and watched cartoons. About 15 minutes later I hear the dog barking again. I looked about my window and saw a dog in the living room window looking in my direction. So I and my 8-year-old self thought the dog was looking at me, so I waved and said, "Hi doggy." The dog is a big black dog, looked like a rot. It barked back. It was very dark in that house, and after it barked back, I saw it slowly fading into the darkness. It wasn't moving, it was fading. I was so confused. Then I heard sirens getting closer from outside and saw a policeman park out in front of our house. I ran down to tell my mom about the dog, but she and the landlord were talking to the cop. I told my mom about the dog and she had a very sick look on her face, like she was about to throw up. My dad told me to go watch TV in the living room with my mom as he, the landlord, and the cop were going to go check out the house. The cop came walking out of the house with an old homeless-looking man in cuffs. He must have just broken in, and they found him hiding in a cabinet by the window I was standing at. After getting the man in the police car, they came back into the house with a ripped-up dog collar and some papers. The collar looked old and worn out, like it had been sitting outside for years. The cop handed my mom the papers and asked me if this is the collar the dog was wearing that I saw. I said yes, but the one the dog was wearing looked brand new. You could tell it was the same one, only this one was destroyed. The papers he handed my mom was some random junk mail and a vacancy slip. That was all in the mailbox. The names on the mail were all scribbled out with what looked like to be crayon, all except for one, that said to Mrs. Bell Rolfe and Robert Rolfe. It was a birthday card addressed to Robert Rolfe. It said "Happy 9th birthday kiddo" on it, and inside was just a regular birthday card. But the date was nowhere near the recent date. It said June 8, 1933. My parents both looked at each other. I didn't understand, so I asked my parents why the date was weird. They couldn't give me an answer. Apparently, there was a family who lived there by those names back in 1933, but the husband killed the wife and son on the night before his 9th birthday, and their Rottweiler Coco had attacked and killed the husband. As the guests started rolling in that evening, they found all 3 dead in the house, but the dog was outside chained to a tree, starved and dead. It was a case no one could ever figure out. We ended up moving out of the house a week later. Growing up, remembering that frightens me to this day, but for some reason, I can't get over the thought of how that ghost dog may have actually saved my life that day, by making me go home. I don't know exactly how all of this happened, or what it meant, but either way, I still can't get a good night's sleep. I'd have nightmares about the dog in the window, but what scares me most is, what if I had knocked on that window that day? Would that man have done something to me? And how did I hear and see dead people and a dog? It all still makes no sense, and probably never will. It is all a mystery.
Yeah.